The Hindu Kush Mountains did not care about reputations. They did not care about medals or service records or the kind of quiet legend that builds around a man over 17 years of doing things that other men couldn't or wouldn't do. The mountains simply existed, ancient and indifferent and brutally honest, and they had a way of reducing every human being who entered them to the same fundamental equation: adapt or die. Master Chief Petty Officer Ethan Calloway had been adapting since he was 19 years old. He had grown up in Harlan County, Kentucky, a place that had its own relationship with hardness, the kind of small Appalachian town where the landscape itself seemed to be teaching you something from birth, where winters came mean and early, and the men who survived them didn't talk much about surviving them. His father, Robert Calloway, had worked the coal mines for 23 years before his lungs decided they'd had enough. His mother, Diane, had worked 2 jobs and raised 3 children with the specific brand of quiet ferocity that Appalachian women had been perfecting for generations. Ethan had been the middle child, not the oldest who carried the weight of expectation, not the youngest who carried the benefit of it. He existed in that particular middle child space where you learn early that nobody is automatically paying attention to you. And so, you develop the ability to move through the world with a self-sufficiency that later, in a different context, under different circumstances, a Navy SEAL instructor would look at during Hell Week and describe in an evaluation as operates with unusual independence under maximum stress. What the instructor meant was, this one has been practicing suffering his whole life. He had enlisted at 19, partly because the military offered a path out of Harlan County, and partly because something in Ethan Calloway had always needed a framework, a structure large enough and demanding enough to contain the particular intensity that had always lived inside him. He had been the kid who ran 5 miles before school not because anyone told him to, but because standing still felt like a waste of something. He had been the kid who took apart engines and put them back together, who read military history at 14 with the focused attention most teenagers reserved for things that actually interested them, who had climbed every significant ridge in a 40-mile radius before he turned 17 simply because the ridge was there, and he wanted to know what was on the other side. The Navy hadn't made Ethan Calloway intense. It had simply given that intensity a direction. Bud's basic underwater demolition SEAL training broke men the way the Hindu Kush broke men, comprehensively, without apology, and with a complete disinterest in your previous accomplishments. It was one of the most demanding military training pipelines in the world, and its dropout rate was a number that the Navy published with a particular institutional pride. The cold Pacific water off Coronado, California had a way of clarifying a man's relationship with his own limits. Most men, when they discovered those limits, rang the bell and walked away, and there was no shame in it, because it took a particular kind of courage just to try. Ethan Calloway did not ring the bell. Not during Hell Week, when sleep deprivation reduced grown men to weeping in the sand and hypothermia was a constant companion, and the instructors moved through the chaos with the cheerful professionalism of people who had been breaking humans for years and found the work genuinely satisfying. Not during the log carries, when the physical pain reached frequencies that the human body wasn't designed to sustain, and the only available response was to simply refuse to stop. Not during the ocean swims in water so cold that the body's extremities began filing formal complaints within minutes. He didn't just survive Bud's, he became one of those rare trainees who seemed to draw something from the suffering, not masochistically, not with any performance of toughness, but with the quiet practicality of a man who had grown up in a hard place and understood on a cellular level that discomfort was temporary and quitting was permanent. His instructors noted it. They always noticed the ones who were different. Sniper school came later, and it was there that Ethan Calloway found the specific expression of his particular gifts. Marksmanship had always come naturally to him. He had been hunting in the Kentucky hills since he was 12, had learned to read wind and distance and animal behavior from his Uncle Carl, who was the kind of man who considered a missed shot a personal moral failure. But military sniping was something beyond marksmanship. It was a discipline that demanded a complete integration of physical skill, psychological control, tactical intelligence, and a capacity for stillness that most human beings, wired as they are for movement and stimulation, simply cannot access. The average person placed in a hide site in enemy territory, required to remain motionless for 8, 10, 12 hours, would experience a psychological deterioration that no amount of willpower could entirely prevent. The mind needed input. It needed movement. It needed the reassurance of doing something. Waiting in those conditions felt less like patience and more like a slow erosion. Ethan Calloway could wait the way mountains waited, completely, without complaint, without the internal negotiation that most people had to manage, the part of the mind that kept checking the clock, kept calculating how much longer, kept asking whether this was really necessary. He simply settled into stillness and became part of whatever environment contained him. Rock, sand, scrub, brush, shadow, it didn't matter. He was present without being visible, alert without being tense, and ready without the hair-trigger anxiety that made lesser snipers flinch at the wrong moment. His instructors gave him the call sign Ghost during an evaluation exercise in which he successfully inserted into a simulated enemy compound, observed and logged 17 tactical data points, and exfiltrated without a single member of the opposing force. 11 experienced operators tasked specifically with finding him, detecting his presence. Afterward, the lead instructor had stood in front of the assembled class and said, with the flat delivery of a man who did not traffic in hyperbole, "Calloway was in your perimeter for 6 hours. Some of you walked within 4 feet of him. I want you to think about what that means." The class had thought about it. Some of them still thought about it years later. By the time Ghost arrived in Afghanistan for his first deployment, he had already built the internal architecture of a man who understood his own capabilities and their cost. He was not arrogant. Arrogance in that environment was a fast way to become a casualty statistic, and Ghost was too intelligent and too observant to mistake confidence for invincibility. But he carried himself with the particular settled quality of a person who has been tested in ways that removed all the unnecessary uncertainty about who they are. His teammates trusted him completely and immediately, which was not something that happened easily in a SEAL team. Trust in that environment was earned through demonstrated competence and confirmed under fire, and Ghost earned his in the first month of his first deployment with a series of decisions under pressure that his team leader would later describe in an after-action review as exactly right, every time, when exactly right was the only acceptable standard. 312 confirmed kills across 6 deployments, each one documented, each one justified within the parameters of his engagement authority, each one carried in the particular way that operators carried the weight of their work, not publicly, not dramatically, but always. Ghost never talked about his record. When newer operators, awed by the numbers, tried to raise it, he would redirect the conversation with a patience that discouraged repetition. "The number doesn't mean anything," he said once to a young petty officer who had asked. "The decisions behind the number, those mean everything." On a Tuesday morning in October, Ghost was positioned on a ridgeline overlooking a valley outside Kandahar, settled into a hide he had prepared the night before with the methodical care he applied to everything. The intelligence was solid. The target was confirmed. His spotter, Petty Officer Second Class Danny Rackley, 6 years as Ghost's eyes, a man who could read a landscape like a book, was 3 feet to his left, communicating in the clipped shorthand of 2 people who had been working together long enough to require very few actual words. The morning was cold, the light was flat and gray, and the valley below them was beginning to wake with the particular slow movement of a place that existed in permanent wariness. Ghost had been in position for 4 hours. His body was a controlled engine, breathing regulated, heartbeat managed, muscles in the specific low-tension state that allowed sustained stillness without cramping. His eye was at the scope. His mind was in the quiet place he went when the work required everything, a place beyond thought, beyond doubt, beyond the noise of personality. Pure function, pure presence. He had the target confirmed at 847 meters. Wind was 6 knots from the northwest, with a slight thermal variance he had already calculated and adjusted for. His finger rested against the trigger guard, not on the trigger, never on the trigger until the decision was made, and the decision was right. Rack murmured a final wind update. Ghost made a micro-adjustment that no instrument in the world could have measured, but his body knew was correct. He breathed out, slow, complete. He never heard the shot that hit him. The round came from the eastern ridge, elevated, angled, from a position that shouldn't have been occupied, from a shooter who should not have been there, from an intelligence failure that would be investigated for months and never fully explained. It struck Ghost in the left side with a force that translated instantly into white obliteration. Not pain, not yet, because the nervous system needed a moment to process what had just happened to it, and sent him rolling down the ridge in a chaos of equipment and loose rock and the terrible understanding that he was no longer in control. He registered 3 things in the seconds before consciousness began to dissolve. The collapsed lung, unmistakable, the asymmetric pull of a chest that could no longer fully expand. The blood, too much of it, too fast, soaking through his kit with the indifferent efficiency of a serious wound doing what serious wounds do. And Rack's voice, his spotter, his partner, already on the radio, with the controlled urgency of a trained man doing the right thing, even though the right thing was clearly costing him something to do. Ghost is down, Ghost is down. We need medevac now, Eastern Ridge, grid follows. Ghost tried to speak. Tried to give Rack something useful, the Eastern Ridge position, the shooter's probable angle, the tactical information that was still assembling itself in his fatting mind, with the professional stubbornness of a man who had always believed that information was the most valuable thing he carried. What came out was not words. The darkness arrived the way darkness arrives for people who have been spending themselves at full capacity for 17 years, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, total and absolute, like a light that had been burning at maximum intensity finally going out. His last conscious thought was not about the mission. It was not about the target, or the Eastern Ridge shooter, or the tactical situation that his team would now have to manage without him. His last conscious thought, arriving with the strange clarity that sometimes visits people at the absolute edge of themselves, was an image of Harlan County in the early morning, the ridgelands going blue-gray in the first light, the valley still in shadow, the world both small and enormous in the way it only ever is when you are very young and have not yet learned that some mornings do not lead to afternoons. He thought, I should have called my mother last week. And then Ghost was gone into a darkness so deep and so complete that the field medic who reached him 40 seconds later, pressing both hands against a wound that demanded more than 2 hands could give, looked up at Rack with an expression that communicated everything that professional obligation prevented him from saying out loud. Rack looked back at him, set his jaw, and said the only thing there was to say. Keep working. The helicopter didn't so much land at Walter Reed as it surrendered to the ground. Chief Warrant Officer Dana Price had been flying medevac missions for 11 years across 3 combat theaters, and she had developed the particular emotional callousness that the job required, not indifference, never indifference, but a professional distance that allowed her to do what needed doing without the weight of it crushing her mid-flight. She had carried boys who were already gone and men who were almost there and everything in between, and she had learned to keep her hands steady and her focus forward regardless of what was happening behind her in the cabin. but she pushed that helicopter harder than she had ever pushed anything with rotors. She didn't know why exactly. She had heard the radio traffic, "Ghost is down, Ghost is down," and something in the field medic's voice had communicated an urgency that bypassed her professional filters entirely and went straight to the part of her that was simply human. She had looked at her co-pilot once briefly, and he had already read it in her face, and he had nodded, and she had opened the throttle in a way that made the aircraft shudder with something that felt almost like effort. 41 minutes. That was how long field medic specialist Joel Doc Tanner kept Ethan Calloway alive on a ridgeline in Kandahar with equipment that fit in a pack and knowledge that lived in his hands. He used a chest seal on the collapsed lung, applied with the speed of someone who had practiced the motion so many times it had become pure muscle memory. He packed the wound with the focused economy of a man who understood that hesitation was a form of failure. He maintained airway, monitored pulse, thready, inconsistent, stubborn, and talked to Ghost the entire time in the low, steady voice of someone who knew on some level that the man couldn't hear him and did it anyway. "You're not done, Chief, you hear me. You are not done, stay with me, stay right here." Ghost gave no indication that he heard, but his heart kept beating, and Doc Tanner chose to interpret that as agreement. The trauma team at Walter Reed had been notified 12 minutes before the helicopter arrived, which gave them exactly enough time to assemble the right people, and not quite enough time to feel ready for what came through the doors. Trauma Bay 3 became, for the next 4 hours, a controlled storm, organized, precise, relentlessly purposeful, and operating at the absolute ceiling of what American military medicine could offer. Dr. Raymond Holt led the team. He was 51 years old, built like a man who had once been athletic, and now channeled that same physical discipline into a stillness that his residents found either reassuring or unnerving depending on their own temperament. He had done 2 tours as a forward surgical team surgeon early in his career, had operated in conditions that would make most civilian trauma surgeons reconsider their professional choices, and had returned to Walter Reed with a set of skills and a psychological framework that were not available in any textbook. He looked at Ghost's vitals on the transfer sheet and said nothing. His face communicated nothing. He simply moved to the head of the bed, assessed what was in front of him, and began making decisions with the rapid, sequential logic of a man whose mind had been trained to function at maximum capacity precisely when everything around it was on fire. The collapsed lung came first. A chest tube inserted with the efficiency of a motion performed hundreds of times, the kind of procedural fluency that looks almost casual to an observer and represents years of accumulated competence. The lung began to re-expand with the slow, reluctant cooperation of damaged tissue doing its best under the circumstances. Then the bleeding. This was the true enemy, not the wound itself, which was severe, but the hemorrhage that the wound was producing, steadily and without any interest in being stopped. Ghost had lost a volume of blood that the numbers on the transfer sheet communicated in the flat language of medicine, and that the people in that room translated in their own private calculations into something more visceral and more urgent. They transfused. They operated. They repaired what could be repaired and managed what couldn't yet be addressed and made the sequential, prioritized decisions that trauma surgery demanded. Not the perfect solution, because there was no perfect solution, but the best available solution, applied in the right order at the right time. 4 hours. 2 attending surgeons, an anesthesiologist, 2 scrub nurses, and a circulating nurse who kept the room supplied and the communication flowing, and who would later say, in the quiet honesty of a debrief, that she had prayed continuously for the duration in a way she hadn't done since she was a child. Ghost survived the first surgery. He came back to the OR 18 hours later. The repair work from the first surgery had held mostly, but a secondary bleed had developed with the unhelpful timing of a complication that announces itself only after you think you've handled the situation, and the team reassembled with the grim efficiency of people who had been here before and knew what was required. Second surgery, 3 hours and 40 minutes. Ghost survived that one too. The third surgery was shorter, targeted corrective, addressing a specific structural concern that the first two procedures had exposed. By the time it was finished, Dr. Holt stood at the scrub sink washing his hands with the mechanical repetition of a man processing something that his professional vocabulary wasn't entirely equipped to describe. And his senior resident, Dr. Priya Anand, 29 years old and still at the stage of her career where outcomes landed with their full emotional weight, stood beside him and asked the question she needed to ask. Is he going to make it? Holt was quiet for a moment, dried his hands, looked at the wall in front of him with the expression of a man giving an honest answer, the respect of actual consideration. His body is going to make it, he said finally. I'm less certain about the rest of him. Anand wasn't sure what that meant. She found out over the next 72 hours. Ward 7 at Walter Reed had a particular quality that was different from civilian ICUs, not in its equipment or its protocols, which were excellent, but in its atmosphere. The patients who came through Ward 7 were not civilians who had been struck by illness or accident. They were people who had chosen, deliberately and with full understanding of the risks, to put themselves in the way of violence on behalf of other people. That choice hung in the air of the ward in a way that the staff felt and rarely articulated, a weight that made the work feel different, the stakes feel different, the obligation feel different. Ghost was in room 14. The room had a window that looked out over a parking lot, which was not a view that offered much in the way of consolation, but the morning light came through it at an angle that was almost pleasant, and the staff had taped a small American flag to the upper corner of the glass in the way that Ward 7 staff sometimes did for the patients who they felt deserved the acknowledgement. His vitals stabilized after the third surgery. The numbers on his monitors settled into a pattern that the nursing staff learned to read the way you learn to read any language that matters, with attention, with experience, and with the understanding that what the numbers said and what they meant were sometimes two different things. What the numbers said, stable, holding, alive. What the attending physician understood, with a growing unease that he expressed in carefully measured language during rounds and in considerably less measured language in his own private assessment. This man was not fighting. It was not a clinical term. There was no ICD code for it, no measurable biomarker that captured it, no imaging that could display it on a screen for a team to review. But Dr. Raymond Holt had been doing this long enough to know the difference between a body that was recovering and a body that was simply running on the reserves of its previous investment. Ghost's body was extraordinary, built and maintained over 17 years to a standard that was several deviations from the norm, and it was keeping him alive on the strength of that investment. But the man inside the body, the essential operational intelligence that had made Ethan Calloway into the thing called Ghost actual, that was somewhere else. Somewhere the medicine couldn't follow. They tried everything that fell within the boundaries of evidence-based medicine, and several things that existed in the productive space between evidence and instinct. The chaplain, Father Michael Donahue, a compact Irishman from Cork who had been providing pastoral care at Walter Reed for 9 years, and had developed an equanimity about the human condition that bordered on the philosophical, sat beside Ghost's bed for 2 hours on the second day, and spoke quietly about anything and nothing. He talked about the weather. He talked about a fishing trip he'd taken in Montana the previous summer. He talked about grace in the specific, unsentimental way that soldiers tended to respond to better than the more elaborate theological framings. He watched Ghost's face the entire time with the patient attention of a man accustomed to waiting for a response that might come in any form. Ghost gave him nothing. The sister, Sarah Calloway Marsh, flying in from Phoenix with red eyes and a carry-on she'd packed in 7 minutes, sat beside her brother for 3 hours and held his hand and talked to him in the voice of someone who had known this man since before he was anyone's master chief, before he was anyone's ghost, when he was just her annoying middle brother who ate the last of the cereal and left the bowl in the sink. She told him stories from childhood. She told him their mother's garden was doing well. She told him, in a voice that broke only once and recovered quickly because Sarah Calloway Marsh was her mother's daughter, that he was not allowed to leave without saying goodbye. Ghost's fingers lay still in her hand. His face was the face of a man very far away. Two of his teammates, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb and Petty Officer First Class Jerome Rome Castillo, flew in from Virginia Beach and sat with him for an afternoon, talking in the specific shorthand of men who had been in terrible places together and survived them. They talked about missions. They talked about the team. Rome told a story about a goat and a misplaced piece of equipment in Helmand Province that under normal circumstances would have made Ghost's expression crack in the way it occasionally cracked when something genuinely amused him. A slight compression at the corners of his eyes, the ghost of a smile that never quite became a full one. Nothing. Webb, who had known Ghost for 9 years and was not a man given to visible emotion, stood in the corridor outside room 14 afterward and stared at the middle distance for a long time. Rome stood next to him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying. It was Dr. Holt who used the word plateau on the morning of the 4th day, standing in the corridor with the senior nursing staff and his resident in a gathering that had the quiet gravity of people confronting a problem that their training hadn't fully equipped them for. He stopped declining, Holt said. The chart was in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. His numbers are holding. By every measurable standard, he is stable. He paused. Let that word occupy the space it deserved. But he is not recovering. He is not engaging. Whatever it is that makes a person choose to continue, that mechanism is not currently operational in our patient. Another pause. And I don't have a pharmacological or procedural response to that. I want ideas. I want anything. The senior nurse, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells, who had 20 years on this ward and had seen more than she discussed, looked at the closed door of room 14 with the expression of a woman running through a catalog of everything she knew. Some men, she said carefully, come back in their own time, when they're ready. And some men, Holt replied, with the honesty that made his staff both respect and occasionally dread working for him, don't come back at all. The hallway was quiet for a moment. Down at the far end of the corridor, a new nurse, 11 days on the ward, young, precise, daughter of a Marine, looked up briefly from the medication cart she was restocking and then looked back down. She had been listening. Maya Reyes had learned to listen before she learned to speak. That was how her father had described it once, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation delivered with the particular pride of a man who recognized in his daughter a quality he valued above almost everything else. Sergeant First Class Dominic Reyes, United States Marine Corps, had spent 21 years in logistics, the unglamorous, essential backbone of military operations that kept ammunition moving and food arriving and equipment functioning in places where none of those things arrived easily. He was not a man who had charged hills or earned combat decorations. He was a man who understood systems, who could look at a supply chain the way other people looked at a landscape and immediately identify every point of vulnerability, every inefficiency, every place where the whole architecture was one bad decision away from collapse. He had raised Maya the same way he managed logistics, with patience, with attention to detail, and with the foundational conviction that understanding a situation completely was always more valuable than reacting to it quickly. Maya's mother, Carmen, was a registered nurse who had worked the night shift at a civilian hospital in San Diego for 16 years, while raising 2 children on a schedule that would have broken someone less organized. She moved through their small house on Coronado Avenue with the efficient grace of a woman, who had learned to do everything at three-quarter speed, because full speed was unsustainable across the long distances that life actually required. She smelled of antiseptic and the particular floral lotion she applied every morning without fail, and she had a way of assessing a situation, any situation, domestic or medical or interpersonal, with a diagnostic speed that Maya had absorbed without realizing she was absorbing it. From her father, Maya had inherited the capacity for systems thinking, the ability to see the architecture beneath the surface of things. From her mother, she had inherited the clinical instinct, the ability to look at a human being and read what the body was communicating beyond what the mouth was saying. The combination produced something unusual, something that her professors at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences had noted in evaluations with a care that suggested they weren't entirely sure how to categorize it. Reyes demonstrates diagnostic intuition significantly beyond her training level, one attending physician had written. Recommend monitoring in the best possible sense of that phrase. She had wanted to be a nurse since she was 9 years old. Not because of a dramatic moment, not because of a single formative experience that she could point to as the origin of the calling. It had simply been present in her for as long as she could examine her own inclinations, the way some people are simply drawn to music or mathematics or the sea. She had spent her childhood watching her mother come home from night shifts with the particular exhausted satisfaction of someone who had done something that mattered, and that combination, the exhaustion and the satisfaction arriving together, inseparable, had seemed to Maya not like a warning but like a description of a life worth living. The military pathway had been her father's suggestion, offered carefully and once, with the caveat that it was only a suggestion and she should make her own decision. She had thought about it for 2 weeks with the thoroughness that characterized her approach to everything important, and then she had made the decision that it was the right one, not because her father had suggested it, but because the framework it offered aligned with qualities she recognized in herself. The structure, the hierarchy that was demanding but comprehensible, the sense of service that was concrete rather than abstract. She had excelled at the Uniformed Services University with the quiet consistency of someone who wasn't trying to be noticed and therefore kept being noticed. She asked better questions than most of her peers, not because she was performing intellectual curiosity, but because she was genuinely, constitutionally incapable of accepting incomplete understanding. A partial answer was, to Maya Reyes, simply the beginning of a more specific question. Her clinical rotations had confirmed what her professors suspected, that she had a gift for the patients other practitioners found difficult. The ones who were withdrawn, the ones who had retreated behind walls of pain or fear, or the particular psychological armor that people constructed when they had been through things that ordinary human experience didn't prepare you for. Maya had a capacity for stillness and patience that made those patients feel, in ways they often couldn't articulate, that the space around her was safe, that she was not going to rush them, that she was going to wait for exactly as long as it took. Portsmouth Naval Hospital had been her first assignment, 6 months that taught her the specific rhythms and particular demands of military medical care, the way that service members presented differently from civilian patients, the ways that military culture shaped both the injuries and the recovery, and the complex emotional architecture around both. She had learned to read the particular stoicism that military patients defaulted to, the trained suppression of vulnerability that made clinical assessment simultaneously more challenging and more important, because what wasn't being said was often the most medically relevant information in the room. Walter Reed had been her second assignment. 11 days in, she was still learning the specific topography of Ward 7, the personalities of the senior staff, the rhythms of the patient population, the unwritten rules that governed how the ward actually functioned as opposed to how it functioned on paper. She was careful. She was observant. She followed protocol with a precision that the charge nurse, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells, had noted approvingly in her first-week evaluation. She was also, beneath the careful protocol-following exterior, cataloging everything she saw with the systematic attention of her father's daughter. She first became aware of room 14 on her second day. Not because anyone directed her attention there, the opposite actually. The studied casualness with which the senior staff moved past that particular door communicated, to Maya's finely calibrated antenna for unspoken information, that something significant was happening inside it. The way conversations shifted slightly when room 14 was mentioned. The way Dr. Holt's expression, which was controlled to the point of near blankness during rounds, acquired a particular quality of contained frustration when the patient in that room came up in discussion. She read the public-facing portions of the chart on day 3, the clinical notes, the surgical reports, the vitals logs. What she read was the story of a body that had been catastrophically damaged and heroically repaired, and was now, by every measurable standard, doing what it was supposed to do: stable, holding, alive. But Maya had her mother's instinct for what wasn't in the chart, and what wasn't in the chart was a person who was choosing to be there. She didn't pursue it further. Not then. She was 11 days into a new assignment. She was junior staff in a ward that operated on clear hierarchy, and she had enough professional self-awareness to understand that going to her charge nurse with a theory about the psychological withdrawal of a patient she had not been assigned to would not be received as the kind of initiative that built a nursing reputation. She filed it. She watched from a distance. She paid attention in the way she always paid attention, completely, patiently, without urgency. On her third overnight shift, something changed. The 3 a.m. quality of Ward 7 was its own specific phenomenon, a stillness that was different from the stillness of earlier hours, when the ward was merely quiet, and different from the stillness of pre-dawn, when the machinery of the day shift began its invisible preparation. The 3 a.m. stillness was the deepest point of the night's curve, the moment when the building itself seemed to exhale, when the monitors and the ventilators and the soft infrastructure sounds of the ward settled into a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Maya was restocking a medication cart at the far end of the corridor when she heard Dr. Holt use the word plateau. She had her back to the group. She continued restocking. She listened. She heard everything: the clinical assessment, the honest admission of professional limitation, the request for ideas that contained within it the particular weight of a very good physician acknowledging that the problem in front of him was beyond the reach of his tools. She heard Patricia Wells offer the observation about men coming back in their own time. She heard Holt's response, and the way that the silence after it landed was not the silence of people who disagreed, but the silence of people who were afraid he was right. She kept restocking the cart. Her hands were steady. Her face communicated nothing. But something inside her had shifted into a different gear, the particular engaged alertness of a person who has just identified a problem that they believe they might be able to do something about. Her father called it the logistics moment, the instant when you stopped describing the problem and started designing the solution. She waited until the senior staff had dispersed. Then she walked to the nurse's station and pulled Ghost's full file. She read for 40 minutes. The surgical reports first, thorough. She needed to understand the physical architecture of what he had survived. Then the nursing notes, reading between the clinical language for the observational data that nurses recorded differently from physicians, with a different vocabulary and a different set of priorities. Then the chaplain's visit log, which was brief and communicated in its brevity more than a longer document might have. Then the visitor records the sister, the teammates, the commanding officer who had made the trip from Virginia Beach and sat for 30 minutes and left without speaking to anyone on the staff. And then the attached deployment documentation, field coordination notes, tactical communication logs, the administrative archaeology of 6 deployments across 17 years. She almost missed it. It was buried in a coordination annex from his most recent deployment, a document that had been attached to his medical file for identification and next-of-kin purposes, and that nobody in the medical team had any particular reason to read carefully, because the clinical information they needed was in the surgical reports, not the tactical records. She found it on page 7 of the annex, a field identifier notation, logged by his team leader across multiple operational reports, used as the radio designation for Ghost's position and status. 2 words, typed in the standard block formatting of military documentation, carrying in that formatting exactly none of the weight they actually held. Ghost Actual. Maya stared at those 2 words for a long time. She understood call signs, had grown up understanding them, because her father's world was built on the specific language of military communication, where every designation carried meaning, where the difference between a call sign and a nickname was the difference between operational identity and casual label. A call sign was not what people called you. A call sign was what you were called when you were doing the thing you had built yourself to do. It was the name of your most functional self, the self that existed at the intersection of training and commitment, and the particular kind of person you had chosen to become. Ghost Actual, not Ghost. Every operator had a call sign, a handle, something the team used in the field. Actual was different. Actual was the designation added when you needed to communicate that you were speaking to or about the primary, not a representative, not a subordinate, but the actual operational commander. Ghost Actual meant, this is the real one. This is the one who makes the decisions. This is the one who is fully present and fully accountable and fully in command. It was the name of the version of Ethan Calloway that had never once failed. Maya closed the file. She sat at the nurse's station for a moment in the 3 a.m. stillness of Ward 7, looking at the closed door of room 14 at the end of the corridor. She thought about what she knew clinically, observationally, intuitively. She thought about what the senior physicians had tried. She thought about the sister's voice and the teammates' presence and the chaplain's pastoral patience, all of them speaking to Ethan, to the brother, the friend, the man, and finding no one home. She thought about her father's voice on the phone during her first week at Portsmouth, when she had called him uncertain about a patient's situation, and he had listened to everything she said and then been quiet for a moment and said, "Mija, sometimes the system is fine. Sometimes it's just using the wrong frequency." The wrong frequency. She stood up. She walked down the corridor. She stopped outside room 14 and looked through the small window in the door at the man in the bed, still, pale, present only in the most mechanical sense of the word. And she made a decision that had no clinical precedent, no protocol, no framework to stand behind. She made it anyway, because her mother had taught her that medicine was the science of healing, and her father had taught her that the science was only ever as good as the person applying it. And sometimes applying it correctly meant using every instrument available, including the ones that didn't appear in any manual. She pushed the door open. She stepped inside. And for the first time in 11 days on Ward 7, Lieutenant J.G. Maya Reyes walked into room 14 with a clear and specific purpose. She had identified the right frequency. Now she was going to transmit. The room was smaller at night. That was the thing Maya noticed first, not a physical reality, obviously, but an atmospheric one. During the day, room 14 existed within the larger organism of the ward, connected to its rhythms and its noise and its constant purposeful movement. Nurses came and went. Equipment was checked and adjusted. Dr. Holt conducted rounds with his resident and his clipboard and his carefully controlled expression. Orderlies moved with quiet efficiency. The room was a node in a functioning system, and that systemic context gave it a kind of openness, a sense of the world continuing beyond its walls. At 3 a.m., the world beyond the walls had stepped back. The corridor outside was empty in both directions, lit by the particular flat fluorescence of institutional overnight lighting that cast no shadows and offered no warmth. The monitors beside Ghost's bed produced their steady, indifferent music, the soft percussion of a cardiac rhythm that was doing its job without enthusiasm, the mechanical patience of a ventilator that had no opinion about its patient and would continue regardless. The room was just a room, and the man in the bed was just a man stripped, in this hour, of every layer of context and legend and accumulated reputation, reduced to the fundamental biological fact of a body that was alive and a mind that had gone somewhere else. Maya stood just inside the doorway for a moment and let herself fully arrive. This was something her mother had taught her, not a technique exactly, more of a discipline. Before you engage with a patient, be completely present, not thinking about the last room or the next task or the medication cart waiting at the end of the corridor. Here, now, this person, this moment. She was here, she was completely here. She crossed the room without hurrying. The floor was the standard composite tile of hospital construction, and she had learned in her first week to distribute her weight with each step in a way that minimized sound, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she understood that certain environments deserved a particular quality of entry, and a sleeping ward at 3 a.m. was one of them. She reached the left side of Ghost's bed and stopped. Up close, the reality of what had happened to him was more present than the chart made it. Charts communicated in the abstracted language of data, oxygen saturation percentages, hemoglobin counts, surgical repair notations. They conveyed information about a body without conveying the body itself. Standing beside the bed, Maya saw the body itself, the pallor that went beyond the ordinary paleness of hospital confinement, the slight asymmetry in his chest movement where the repaired lung was still negotiating its recovery, the particular stillness of a face that had stopped performing any of the micro-expressions that animate a human face even in sleep. He was there, and he was not there. She had seen this before, not often, not in the same degree, but she had encountered the phenomenon in her clinical rotations and recognized it for what it was. Not unconsciousness exactly, not the straightforward mechanical absence of a patient under anesthesia, where the absence was chemically produced and would resolve when the chemistry changed. This was something more volitional than that, and therefore more dangerous. This was a person who had, somewhere in the unreachable interior of himself, made a decision, not consciously, not deliberately, but at some level below conscious deliberation, that the distance between where he was and where he needed to be was too great to cover. The medicine had done everything the medicine could do. The body was functional, but the person hadn't come home yet. Maya understood something, standing there in the 3 a.m. quiet of room 14, that she hadn't quite been able to articulate at the nurse's station. The people who had come to reach Ghost, his sister, his teammates, the chaplain, had all come speaking to the man they knew, the brother, the friend, the warrior they had served beside. They had come with love and with history and with the specific emotional vocabulary of people who knew Ethan Calloway and wanted him back. And Ethan Calloway, wherever he was, might not be able to hear them. Because Ethan Calloway, the boy from Harlan County, the brother, the friend, might not be the version of himself that was strong enough to make the journey back. But Ghost Actual might be. She leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, with the careful respect of someone entering another person's space, close enough that what she was about to say would travel the 6 inches between her lips and his ear and go no further, close enough that it would arrive not as sound but as something more direct than sound, something that bypassed the ordinary channels and went straight to wherever the man had gone. She took one breath, her father's breath, the kind he had described to her once, sitting on the porch in the San Diego evening, talking about the moment before something that mattered. Not deep, not dramatic, just complete, just real. She whispered, "Ghost Actual, we still need you out here." 5 words, delivered in the register of a radio transmission, not a plea, not an emotional appeal, not the voice of someone asking a favor. The voice of someone making a professional communication. Calm, certain, carrying within its calmness the implicit message that the person on the other end of the transmission was expected to respond, not hope to respond, not beg to respond. Expected. Because that was what the designation meant. Actual meant the primary was on the line. Actual meant you didn't ask, you reported. You didn't plead, you updated. The communication protocol itself contained within it the assumption of the other person's presence and capability. She was not asking Ghost to come back. She was reporting to him as if he were already operational, as if the only thing standing between his current position and full functionality was the information that he was needed. Maya straightened, stepped back one pace, and waited. The room held its breath. The monitors continued their steady, uncommitted music. The ventilator maintained its rhythm. The overnight light from the parking lot fell through the window at its shallow angle, illuminating nothing in particular. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed softly, another nurse making rounds, the ordinary nocturnal mechanics of the ward continuing without reference to what was happening in room 14. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Maya stood absolutely still. She was not holding her breath. That would have been the posture of hope, and hope had a quality of uncertainty about it that she wasn't willing to import into this moment. She was simply present, waiting. The way her father waited for a logistics problem to resolve once the correct solution had been implemented, not anxiously, not impatiently, but with the grounded confidence of someone who had done the right thing and understood that the right thing took the time it took. 4 seconds. Ethan Calloway's right hand moved. It was not dramatic. There was no gasp, no sudden physical awakening, no cinematic surge back into consciousness. It was 4 fingers, the index, middle, ring, and little finger of his right hand, curling slowly, incompletely inward against the white surface of the hospital blanket. A motion so subtle that a less attentive observer would have catalogued it as involuntary, as the random neuromuscular firing that unconscious bodies occasionally produced, as nothing. Maya saw it as everything, because she recognized the motion. She had seen it once before in a photograph in her father's study, taken at Camp Pendleton during a training exercise, showing a group of Marines in a prone firing position. The way the hand curled around the grip of a rifle, the specific geometry of fingers finding something they had held 10,000 times. The motion that lived in muscle memory so deep that it existed below consciousness, below volition, below the level of any decision the thinking mind could make or unmake. Ghost's hand was reaching for his rifle, not because he knew he was reaching for it, not because he had decided to reach for it, but because somewhere in the deep operational architecture of the man called Ghost Actual, something had received a transmission and was responding the only way it knew how. Still here, still functional, still on the line. Maya let out a breath she hadn't entirely realized she'd been holding. Not a sob, not a gasp, just a breath. Long, quiet, complete. She stood in the room for another 30 seconds, watching his face with the focused patience of someone monitoring a frequency for a second transmission. His fingers slowly uncurled and returned to rest. His face remained still. The monitors reported nothing unusual. The room settled back into its 3 a.m. composure as if nothing had occurred. But something had occurred. Maya was certain of it with a certainty that went beyond clinical evidence and beyond protocol, and into the territory of the knowledge that simply is, the kind of knowledge that arrives without explanation and doesn't require one. She walked back to the nurse's station, sat down, noted nothing unusual in her shift log, because what had happened in room 14 at 3:17 a.m. had no category in the shift log's taxonomy, and Maya was precise enough to understand that logging something incorrectly was worse than not logging it at all. She sat for a moment in the 3 a.m. stillness and looked at the wall in front of her. Her hands were folded on the desk. Her breathing was even. Her expression was the expression of a person who has done something they believe was right and is now simply waiting for the evidence to catch up with the belief. Down the corridor, in room 14, Ethan Calloway's fingers lay still against the hospital blanket. But the frequency was open, and Ghost Actual was listening. The body remembered before the mind did. That was the first thing Dr. Priya Anand noted in her personal journal on the morning of day 10, not in Ghost's official chart, where clinical language governed everything, but in the small leather-bound notebook she carried in her coat pocket and wrote in during the 15-minute break she took every morning at 6:30 with a cup of coffee that was never quite hot enough and never quite sufficient. She had started keeping the journal during her residency, on the advice of a senior physician who told her that the cases that changed you deserved to be recorded somewhere that wasn't subject to institutional review. The body remembered before the mind did. She underlined it twice. Then she sat with her inadequate coffee and thought about what she had witnessed over the past 18 hours and tried to find the clinical framework that explained it. She couldn't find one, which was, she was slowly learning, sometimes the most important data point of all. The morning rounds on day 10 began like every other morning rounds. Dr. Holt moving through the ward with his resident, and the charge nurse in the particular formation that hospital hierarchy produced, stopping at each room with the focused efficiency of a man who had a great deal of ground to cover and a precise understanding of how much time each stop deserved. Room 14 was fourth on the circuit. Holt stepped inside with the expression he always wore entering that room, controlled, attentive, carrying within its control the specific quality of a physician who has done everything available to him and is now in the uncomfortable position of waiting for something outside his authority to decide the outcome. He looked at the overnight vitals on the monitor. He looked at the nursing notes from the previous shift. And then he looked at the numbers again, more carefully, with the expression of a man who suspects he may be misreading something and is applying additional scrutiny to confirm that he is not. Oxygen saturation, up 4 points from the previous evening's baseline. Cardiac rhythm, measurably smoother. The jagged inconsistency of the past several days resolved into something that looked almost deliberate. Blood pressure, stable in a way that felt different from the mechanical stability of the days before, less like a system running on reserves and more like a system that had found its footing. "Pull last night's full monitoring log," Holt said quietly to Anand. She pulled it. They reviewed it together at the bedside, tracing the timeline of the night's data with the focused attention of two people looking for the moment when the trajectory changed. They found it not a dramatic spike, not a sudden categorical shift, but a gradual, steady inflection beginning at approximately 3:20 and continuing through the remainder of the overnight period. A slow turning, like a ship that has been drifting finding its heading again. Holt set the tablet down. He looked at Ghost, really looked, with the full attention that round schedules sometimes compressed into efficiency, but that this moment seemed to demand. And for the first time in 4 days, he saw something in that stillness that was different from the stillness that had preceded it. It was hard to name. It was the difference between a room that is empty and a room that is simply quiet, a distinction that registered not in any specific observable feature, but in the whole atmosphere of the space. Something had returned to room 14 that had been absent. Something that the monitoring equipment couldn't measure and the chart couldn't record, and Priya Anand would write about in her leather journal with the honest admission that she didn't have a medical vocabulary for it. Presence, the simple, irreducible fact of a person being in the room they occupied. "Who was on overnight?" Holt asked. Patricia Wells checked the rotation sheet. Kowalski primary, Rays on secondary coverage. Holt nodded slowly, filed it, said nothing further and moved on to the next room because rounds required it. But in the particular filing system of his professional intuition, he placed a small flag beside Maya Reyes' name and left it there. Ghost spoke on day 9 by the official count from his admission, though Maya, who had her own private timeline that began at 3:17 a.m. on the night she stood in room 14, thought of it as day 1 of something new rather than day 9 of something old. The day nurse, Petty Officer Second Class Keisha Truman, a broad-shouldered woman from Atlanta who had been doing this work for 7 years and had developed a compassionate pragmatism that made her exceptionally effective with difficult patients, was conducting a routine assessment when she spoke Ghost's name as part of the standard responsiveness protocol. "Master Chief Calloway, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." She had asked this question, or a version of it, every 4 hours for 4 days. She had received nothing for 4 days. On day 9, his eyelids moved. Not open, not yet, but the muscles beneath them engaged, producing the unmistakable flutter of a person receiving a signal and beginning the long climb back toward the surface. Keisha Truman, who had developed the professional discipline not to react prematurely to ambiguous indicators, kept her voice completely steady as she repeated the instruction. "Master Chief Calloway, squeeze my hand if you can hear me." His hand, the right hand, the same hand that had made its small involuntary motion in the dark 6 nights earlier, closed around hers. Slowly, incompletely, but closed. Keisha pressed the call button for Dr. Holt with her free hand and kept her voice level and said, to the man in the bed whose eyes were still closed, "Good. That's good, Chief. Take your time." She held his hand for the 4 minutes it took Holt to arrive. She didn't say anything else. She understood instinctively, in the way that good nurses understand things that aren't in any manual, that this was not a moment for words. This was a moment for the simple communicative fact of one human hand holding another. The message it sent needed no translation. You are not alone. Someone is here. There is something to come back to. Holt arrived, assessed, kept his expression controlled with the effort that only Annan, standing slightly behind him, could detect in the particular set of his shoulders. He ran the full responsiveness battery, pupillary response, grip strength bilaterally, auditory tracking, pain response at a level calibrated to stimulate without harm. Ghost responded to each assessment with the slow, incomplete engagement of a man surfacing from an extraordinary depth, present enough to respond, not yet present enough to direct. "He's coming back," Holt said, to no one in particular, to everyone in the room, to the monitoring equipment and the morning light coming through the window and the small American flag taped to the glass. Anand wrote in her chart, patient demonstrating improved responsiveness across all assessed domains. Neurological engagement markedly improved from previous 96-hour baseline. Prognosis reassessed, cautiously optimistic. In her personal journal, she wrote, "He decided to come back. I don't know when he decided or why he decided at that particular moment, but the decision was his. The medicine kept him alive long enough for him to make it. That's what we actually did here. We kept the door open and he walked through it himself." She underlined that too. He opened his eyes fully on the morning of what the chart called Day 11. It happened without preamble, no gradual progression through half-open stages, no extended period of flickering awareness. One moment his eyes were closed. The next moment they were open, fixed on the ceiling of room 14 with an expression of focused assessment that was so completely characteristic of the man his file described that Keisha Truman, who happened to be in the room conducting a scheduled check, felt the specific quality of relief that arrives when something you were afraid might be permanently lost turns out to simply have been temporarily misplaced. He stared at the ceiling for 11 seconds. Maya, passing the room on her way to another patient, saw it through the window and counted, not because the count would mean anything clinically, but because she was her father's daughter and her father had always said that precise observation was the foundation of accurate understanding. 11 seconds of ceiling examination. The expression of a man conducting a rapid environmental assessment, cataloging, orienting, establishing his position and condition, and the nature of his current operational environment with the systematic efficiency of someone for whom situational awareness was not a choice but a reflex. Then he spoke. His voice was what happened to a voice after ventilator tubing and days of disuse, and a journey to the edge of the possible and back, rough, reduced, carrying within its roughness the evidence of everything it had been through. But the word it produced was unambiguous, clear in its meaning and in its implication, and in the particular quality of professional orientation that it communicated. Sitrep Ghost said. Keisha Truman blinked once. Then she did something she would describe later to her colleagues with the self-deprecating honesty of a professional acknowledging an unprofessional moment. She laughed. Not loudly, not at him, but the short, involuntary laugh of pure relief, the sound of a person releasing something they have been holding for a long time. "Welcome back, Chief," she said. "You've been gone a while." The rehabilitation that followed was not a gradual process. It was an assault. Ghost approached physical recovery with the same systematic ferocity he had applied to Bud S., to sniper school, to every deployment and every mission and every hard thing his career had required of him. The physical therapist assigned to his case, Lieutenant Darnell Cooper, a former college wrestler from Cleveland, who had developed an excellent professional reputation, based largely on his ability to work with patients who were determined to exceed their prescribed recovery parameters, arrived for their first session with a carefully calibrated treatment plan, and left 2 hours later having substantially revised his understanding of what the word motivated meant. Ghost did not complain. He did not acknowledge pain beyond the functional communication of its location and intensity when Cooper needed that information for clinical purposes. He did not ask when he would be finished or how much longer or whether a particular exercise was really necessary. He simply worked, set after set, repetition after repetition, with the focused patience of a man rebuilding something he understood the value of, not performing toughness for an audience, not proving anything to anyone observing, but genuinely, privately, applying himself to the problem of his own recovery with the same professional commitment he had applied to every other problem his career had presented. Cooper told a colleague after the first week, "I give him a program and he treats it like an operations order. Complete compliance, zero drama, and he's always done before the time I allocated. I've started just giving him harder programs." The scar on his left side pulled when he breathed deeply. He breathed deeply anyway, consistently, because the respiratory therapist had told him that deep breathing was essential to full lung recovery, and Ghost had never in his career failed to execute an instruction that he understood to be operationally necessary. He walked the corridor for the first time on day 4 of active rehabilitation. Slow, deliberate, Cooper at his elbow, with the watchful readiness of someone prepared to intervene, and the growing professional certainty that intervention was not going to be required. Ghost moved down the ward hallway with the focused attention of a man mapping terrain, his eyes tracking the corridor's features with the ingrained observation habit of someone who had spent 17 years in environments where missing a detail could be fatal. He noted the room numbers. He noted the staff patterns, who moved where, on what schedule, with what regularity. He noted the nurses' station at the far end of the corridor, staffed at different hours by different people in a rotation. He began to track with the systematic attention he had once applied to enemy movement patterns. He was looking for something specific. He was looking for the person who had been in room 14 at 3:17 a.m. on a night he technically hadn't been conscious for, and yet somehow knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man whose instincts had been calibrated to a standard that went beyond ordinary knowing, had changed everything. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to say when he found her. He only knew that finding her was a mission-essential objective, and Ghost Actual had never once failed to complete a mission-essential objective. He would find her. He would figure out the words when he got there. He always did, Operators didn't believe in coincidence. It was one of the first things that distinguished a seasoned special operations veteran from everyone else. Not the physical capability, not the tactical knowledge, not even the psychological resilience, though all of those mattered enormously. It was the relationship with information. Civilians moved through the world accepting the surface presentation of events. This happened, then that happened, and the connection between them was either obvious or irrelevant. Operators moved through the world understanding that everything was connected, that coincidence was almost always pattern waiting to be recognized, and that the failure to recognize pattern was the failure that got people killed. Ghost had been reading pattern for 17 years, and the pattern around room 14 had a shape he couldn't ignore. He began with the chart. This was where any good investigation began, with the documented record, the official account, the version of events that the institution had captured in its own language. Ghost had requested access to his own medical file with the quiet authority of a man who understood that asking once, directly, and with complete seriousness was more effective than any other approach. The ward administrator had produced it within the hour. He read it in his room with the methodical attention he had once applied to intelligence briefings, working through each section in sequence, building a chronological understanding of what had happened to his body, from the moment the medevac landed until the present morning. He noted the surgical reports with the professional respect of someone who understood what they represented, the extraordinary competence of people who had rebuilt him when he was beyond rebuilding, and had done it not once but 3 times. He owed those people a debt that he recognized but couldn't currently calculate. He noted the nursing assessment logs, the 4-hourly checks, the responsiveness evaluations, the careful clinical language that documented his non-responsiveness across multiple days with the persistent, undiscouraged thoroughness of staff who continued assessing even when assessment produced nothing, because protocol existed for exactly those situations. And then he found the inflection point. It wasn't dramatic in the chart. The chart didn't do dramatic, it did data. But the data had a shape, and the shape was clear to anyone who knew how to read a timeline with analytical attention. The overnight monitoring log for the night in question showed a gradual, unmistakable improvement beginning at approximately 3:20, vital indicators trending upward, cardiac rhythm stabilizing, the physiological signature of a system that had found something to orient toward. Ghost noted the time. He noted it with the specific attention he gave to details that presented themselves as potentially significant before their significance was confirmed. The sniper's discipline of marking a target before deciding whether it required engagement. He cross-referenced the nursing staff rotation log. This required a second, separate request, phrased as a general inquiry about understanding his care team, which was true enough that it didn't constitute deception and specific enough to produce the information he needed. The overnight shift for the date in question had been staffed by 2 nurses, Petty Officer 2nd Class Daniel Kowalski as primary, and Lieutenant J.G. Maya Reyes as secondary coverage. He had interacted with Kowalski twice during his ambulatory recovery period. A competent, straightforward practitioner who communicated in the direct, efficient manner Ghost preferred, and who had never given him any reason to flag his behavior as anomalous or significant. He had not yet interacted directly with Maya Reyes, but he had observed her. Observation was the foundation of everything Ghost did, and he had been applying it to the staff of Ward 7 since the morning his eyes came fully open and his situational awareness came back online. He couldn't yet conduct the kind of physical reconnaissance that his operational life had required. His body was still in the negotiation phase of recovery, still working out the terms of its return to full function. But observation from a fixed position was something he had practiced extensively. Hide sight work, static surveillance, the discipline of learning everything available from a single vantage point. His corridor walks gave him the vantage point. His room window gave him another, and the particular quality of attention he brought to these observations. The trained, patient, comprehensive attention of a man who had spent years in environments where missing something meant consequences gave him a level of environmental understanding that the ward staff would have found surprising if they had known the degree of it. He had noted Maya Reyes on day 2 of his ambulatory recovery. She was not the kind of person who announced herself. She moved through the ward with a quiet efficiency that had a way of not drawing attention, which paradoxically was exactly the quality that drew his attention. Ghost had spent his career moving through environments without being noticed, and he recognized the quality in others the way a musician recognized technique, not as something being performed, but as something intrinsic. He watched her work. He watched the way she interacted with patients, the specific quality of attention she brought to each room, the way she communicated not just with words but with the calibrated body language of someone who understood that patients read everything, that the angle of approach and the pace of movement and the quality of stillness communicated as much as any spoken assessment. She was precise without being mechanical. She was efficient without being hurried. She was, in the professional assessment of a man who had evaluated people under conditions far more demanding than a hospital ward, exceptionally good at her job. He also noticed, and this was the detail that lodged itself most firmly in his analytical attention, that she never looked at room 14 with any particular significance. She passed it the way she passed every other room. She did not linger. She did not pause. She did not produce any of the micro-behavioral signals that people generated, usually unconsciously, when they had a specific relationship with a specific place. That absence of signal was itself a signal. In intelligence work, the dog that didn't bark was often the most important data point. The absence of the expected behavior was itself information. It meant either that there was nothing there, or that the person was very deliberately not producing the expected behavior. Ghost had encountered both possibilities across his career and had developed a reliable intuition for which was which. Maya Reyes was not producing the expected behavior because she had decided not to. That was his assessment, and his assessments, across 17 years of consequential situations, had been right often enough to trust. He went deeper into the investigation with the systematic patience of a man who understood that good intelligence was built incrementally, not seized in a single operation. He engaged the day nurses in conversation, carefully, indirectly, with the practiced naturalness of someone who had spent years extracting information from people without alerting them to the extraction. He asked general questions about the ward's staffing patterns, about the overnight coverage model, about the rotation system. He listened to the answers with the surface attention of casual interest and the deeper attention of someone building a map. From these conversations, assembled over 4 days, he established that Maya Reyes had been 11 days into her Walter Reed assignment at the time of the inflection point, that her overnight coverage of his room had been secondary rather than primary, meaning she had no assigned, protocol-specified reason to be in room 14 during the overnight period, that she had noted nothing unusual in her shift log for that night, which a primary nurse would have been required to do if a significant patient event had occurred. The shift log entry was the detail that completed his analytical picture. If something clinically significant had happened in room 14 at 3:20, something observable, something documentable, it would have appeared in the nursing notes. Its absence meant one of two things. Nothing documentable had occurred, which was technically possible, or something had occurred that existed outside the taxonomy of documentable clinical events. Ghost had a candidate for the second category. He had been thinking about it since the first morning his mind came back online and began its inventory of the preceding days, working backward through the darkness, trying to locate anything that had penetrated it. Most of it was genuinely inaccessible. The darkness of those days was comprehensive, a blankness that resisted reconstruction. But at one point in that blankness, at a depth he couldn't precisely locate or date, but that felt, in the imprecise geography of recovered memory, like the deepest point. There was something. Not a voice exactly, not a sound in the ordinary sense, more like a frequency, a transmission arriving on a channel that everything else had gone silent on. 2 words, or something like 2 words, arriving not through the ears but through some older, deeper receiving apparatus that operated below the level of conscious processing. He couldn't reconstruct them precisely. The darkness had compressed them, blurred them, the way deep water blurred things seen from the surface. But he carried the impression of them, the shape and weight and particular frequency of those 2 words, like a man carries the memory of a sound he heard once in a critical moment and has never been able to fully identify since. He knew what he was looking for. He knew the frequency those words would have required to travel where they had traveled. And he knew, with the bone-deep certainty that his analytical mind had arrived at through evidence, and that his operational instinct had confirmed before the evidence was complete, who had transmitted them. The physical recovery continued in parallel with the investigation, as Ghost was fully capable of running multiple operations simultaneously, and always had been. Cooper pushed the rehabilitation program harder each week, partly because Ghost's progress demanded it, and partly because Cooper had developed the particular professional investment in this patient's recovery that occasionally happened when a therapist encountered someone who matched or exceeded their own intensity. He redesigned the program 3 times in the first 2 weeks, not because the previous version had failed, but because Ghost had completed it ahead of schedule each time, with the methodical efficiency of someone executing a plan they had already fully internalized. The scar tissue was the honest part of recovery, the part that didn't respond to willpower or discipline or the refusal to acknowledge limitation. Scar tissue operated on its own timeline, and Ghost, who had rarely in his life encountered a constraint that pure effort couldn't modify, had to negotiate with it in a way that was genuinely unfamiliar to him. The left side pulled and compressed in ways that reminded him, with every deep breath and every overhead reach, that the body had its own memory and its own accounting system, and that certain debts were paid on the body's schedule, not the operator's. He paid them without complaint. He paid them with the same silent commitment he brought to everything else, and he noted with the clinical detachment of someone observing an interesting operational constraint that the discomfort was useful data. It told him where the limits currently were, which told him where the work needed to go next. He was walking the full length of the corridor and back without the PT at his elbow by week 3. He was doing resistance work in the rehabilitation gym at 5:30, before his scheduled sessions, by week 3.5. He was, by every clinical measure, recovering at a rate that Dr. Holt described in rounds with professional understatement as ahead of projected timeline, and that Priya Anand described in her personal journal as frankly unreasonable in the best possible way. But the investigation, running quietly alongside the rehabilitation, demanding less of his body and more of his patience, had reached the point where further indirect intelligence gathering was no longer going to advance it. He had established what could be established from observation and inference, and the careful extraction of secondary information. What he needed now was direct engagement. What he needed was to stand in front of Maya Reyes and ask her a question that had no diplomatic framing, that could only be asked directly, and could only be answered honestly, and that would either confirm everything his analytical mind had concluded or reveal a gap in his reasoning that his professional pride would require him to account for. He had been building toward it for 3 weeks, not because he needed 3 weeks to work up the courage. Ghost did not have a complicated relationship with direct action, but because he understood that timing mattered, that the right approach at the wrong moment produced a different outcome than the right approach at the right moment. That patience was not the absence of urgency, but the discipline of matching action to readiness. He was ready, she was on the ward, The corridor between them was clear. Ghost Actual identified his objective, confirmed his approach, and moved. He found her at the nurse's station at the far end of the corridor on a Thursday afternoon. The light outside the window at the particular low angle of a late autumn afternoon. The ward in the relatively quiet interval between lunch rounds and evening assessments. She was reviewing a medication chart with the focused downward attention of a person who was genuinely reading rather than performing the appearance of reading. A distinction Ghost had always been able to identify, and that he noted now with the automatic precision of an observation reflex that never fully switched off. He walked the length of the corridor with the measured pace of a man who was still negotiating with a healing body, but refusing to let the negotiation show more than necessary. He stopped at a distance that communicated respect rather than hesitation, not so far as to require her to raise her voice to be heard, not so close as to produce the interpersonal pressure that proximity could generate when one person in an exchange had something significant to say. He waited. He was exceptionally good at waiting. She looked up after a moment that was exactly long enough to communicate that she had registered his presence and was completing her thought before redirecting her attention. Not a power gesture, not a performance of busyness, simply the natural behavior of a person whose professional focus was genuine and who transitioned between tasks at her own pace rather than at the pace imposed by external interruption. She met his eyes, direct, calm, carrying in her calmness the absence of the particular social nervousness that most people produced when they found themselves the focus of a SEAL Master Chief's full attention. Ghost looked at her for a moment, running the final confirmation of everything his 3 weeks of observation had constructed, measuring the live data point of her face against the analytical model he had built. And then he said what he had come to say. Direct, certain, the only way he knew how. "You called my sign." The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. Not uncomfortably, not with the weight of an accusation or the awkwardness of a confrontation, but with the specific gravity of a true thing spoken plainly into a space that had been waiting, perhaps without knowing it was waiting, for exactly that truth to arrive. Ghost had delivered briefings in classified facilities and after-action reports in forward operating bases and situation assessments in conditions that did not allow for imprecision, and he had learned across all of those experiences that the most important communications were almost always the shortest ones, the ones that had been reduced, through clarity of thought and honesty of purpose, to exactly what they needed to be and nothing beyond. "You called my sign." 5 words. No preamble, no diplomatic scaffolding, no request for confirmation framed as a question, because Ghost had done his investigation, and he was not here to ask whether his conclusion was correct. He was here to acknowledge that it was, to bring it into the spoken world where it could be properly accounted for, properly understood, properly given the weight it deserved. Maya set her chart down. She did it with the deliberate care of someone who understood that what was about to happen deserved her complete attention, and that complete attention required the removal of the things that divided it. The chart went down. Her hands rested on the desk surface, relaxed, not performing anything. She looked at Ghost with the same quality of attention she had given him through the window of room 14 3 weeks earlier. The attention that assessed without judging, that received without deflecting, that communicated in its very steadiness that the person behind it was not going anywhere and was not going to be rattled by the weight of what was being said. The corridor behind Ghost was empty. The ward had settled into its mid-afternoon lull, that particular interval between the organized activity of clinical rounds and the organized activity of evening assessments, when the institutional pace dropped briefly and the building seemed to breathe. A door opened somewhere at the far end of the ward and closed again. A monitor chirped its single-note notification in a room 2 doors down and was silenced by a competent hand within seconds. The world continued its ordinary business around them. Inside the small geography of the nurse's station, something else was happening. Maya looked at him for a moment before she spoke. Not hesitating. She was not a person who hesitated in the way that uncertainty produced hesitation. She was simply completing her own assessment of the moment, the way she completed every assessment, thoroughly, without rushing, with the full deployment of the specific intelligence that was her most fundamental tool. What she saw was a man who had traveled an extraordinary distance and arrived, finally, at something he needed. Not the medical recovery that was ongoing, visible in the careful economy of how he held himself, the slight protective angle of his left side, the controlled deliberateness of his movement that spoke of a body still in negotiation with its own recent history. She saw that. She also saw past it, the way she had always been able to see past the physical presentation to the person behind it. What she saw behind it was a man who had built his entire operational existence on the foundation of knowing who was responsible for what and why, who had spent 17 years in an environment where accountability was not a value but a survival requirement, where the failure to correctly attribute cause and effect, action and consequence, decision and outcome, could end in catastrophe. A man for whom an unattributed action of this magnitude was not simply an unanswered question, but an unresolved operational variable, a loose thread in the fabric of his understanding of what had happened to him, and therefore in his understanding of where he stood now. He needed to know, not out of sentiment, not out of gratitude that was searching for a direction, out of the fundamental operational integrity that had been the architecture of his life for as long as he had been anything at all. She understood that. She understood it the way the daughter of Dominic Reyes understood it in her bones, in the particular calibration of her comprehension that had been shaped by a childhood spent around people for whom accountability was the foundation of everything. So she didn't apologize for it. She didn't deflect it. She didn't offer the social performance of modest denial that the moment might have invited from someone with a different relationship to honesty. She simply told him the truth. "You looked like a man who needed to hear his own name," she said. Her voice was what it always was, level, unhurried, carrying within its levelness a quality of absolute conviction that didn't require elevation to communicate. The kind of name that means something, not the name on your chart. A brief pause, not for effect, but because the next part needed to arrive separately with its own space around it. The name you earned. Ghost was still. The particular stillness of a man receiving information, not processing it yet, just receiving it, letting it arrive completely before the analytical machinery engaged. Maya continued because the truth deserved to be finished. Everyone who came to reach you came speaking to Ethan, your sister, your teammates, the chaplain. They came with everything they had: love, history, memory, and I believe they meant every word of it. She held his gaze steadily. But I read your file, all of it, and I understood that the version of you that was strong enough to make that journey back, that version wasn't Ethan. That version was Ghost actual. She let that sit. She was not someone who rushed to fill the silence that followed an important truth. Silence was not emptiness. It was the space that allowed what had been said to become fully real. Ghost looked at her for a long time, long enough that a less composed person might have felt the need to say something further, to add context or qualification or the social lubricant of additional words. Maya felt none of that need. She had said what was true. The rest was his. She watched him process it. She could see it happening, not in any dramatic external display, because Ghost was not a person who displayed process dramatically, but in the small, almost imperceptible shifts of a face that was doing real work beneath its controlled surface. The slight deepening of focus behind his eyes, the fractional adjustment of his jaw, not tension, but the physical expression of a mind engaging with something at its full depth. The quality of stillness that changed, incrementally, from the stillness of waiting to the stillness of arriving. She had seen this before in patience. The moment when something external met something internal, and the meeting produced not a reaction but a recognition. The moment when the right information reached the right place in a person, and something that had been misaligned settled back into its correct position. It was one of her favorite things about nursing. Not the dramatic saves, not the crisis interventions, but these quiet moments of alignment, these small, precise operations that required no instruments and produced no measurable data and were somehow more significant than either. Ghost was having one of those moments. She could see it. She said nothing and let him have it completely. "It worked," he said finally. 2 words, delivered in the voice of someone who had considered longer formulations and found them insufficient, who had reached for the elaborate expression of what he was carrying and discovered that the true version of it was shorter than that, simpler than that, the kind of simple that lived on the other side of complexity rather than the near side of it. It worked. Not thank you, though the thank you was in it, layered beneath the surface. Not I owe you, though the acknowledgement of debt was in it too. Not the elaborate construction of gratitude that his situation might have seemed to call for, and that his character would not have known how to produce even if it had seemed to call for it. Just, it worked. The operational assessment of a man who evaluated outcomes in the plainest possible language and trusted that the plainness was sufficient. Maya held his gaze. Something moved through her own expression, not quite a smile, not quite its absence. Something in between that was warmer than professional acknowledgement and quieter than personal emotion. The expression of a person who has done something right and knows it, and doesn't need the knowing to be any larger than it is. "I know," she said, and picked her chart back up. Ghost stood for a moment longer, one moment that contained, in its brief duration, more than most moments were asked to hold. He was not a man who experienced many situations that left him without a clear operational next step. His entire professional life had been organized around the principle that there was always a next step, always a target, always a mission, always something specific that needed to be done by a specific person with specific resources in a specific time frame. The clarity of that structure had been one of its great gifts. It organized the world. It made the world navigable even when the world was trying very hard not to be. Standing at the nurse's station on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, watching a junior nurse return her attention to a medication chart with the perfect equanimity of a person who had said what needed saying and had no further agenda, Ghost found himself in a situation that his operational framework didn't quite have a category for. She had done something for him that could not be repaid in any currency he knew how to use. She had reached him when nothing else could reach him, not through skill exactly, though it had required skill to identify the right frequency, and not through courage exactly, though it had required courage to transmit on that frequency without protocol and without guarantee. Through understanding. Through the particular quality of seeing that went past the surface of a person into the operational core of who they actually were. He owed her something. He understood that. But the debt wasn't financial, and it wasn't professional, and it wasn't the kind that could be settled with a formal acknowledgement or an official commendation, or any of the institutional mechanisms by which the military typically processed obligation. It was something else, something that would have to be carried rather than discharged, maintained, like the awareness of a covering position that someone else was holding for you, like the knowledge that someone had your six in a situation where your six had been completely exposed. She had covered his six at the most vulnerable moment of his life, in a darkness so complete that no one else could find him, with nothing but 5 words and the understanding of who he actually was. He turned and walked back down the corridor. His pace was even. His bearing was what it had always been, contained, directional, purposeful. The scar on his left side pulled with the honest reminder of its presence, and he breathed through it the way he breathed through everything completely, without apology. He didn't look back. Ghost had never been a man who looked back. But something had changed in the architecture of how he was carrying himself, something small and structural that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't been paying very close attention for a very long time. A quality of settledness that had been absent since the morning his eyes came open, and he began the long work of reassembling himself from the inside out, as if a weight he hadn't fully identified as a weight had been redistributed. As if a question that had been quietly consuming internal resources since the beginning of his recovery had been answered, not fully, not in all its dimensions, but answered enough. Keisha Truman, coming out of a patient room at the far end of the corridor, saw Ghost walking back toward his room and saw, because she had been doing this work for 7 years, and had developed the clinical attention for the things that charts didn't capture, that something was different in the way he was moving. She couldn't have named it. She filed it under the category she maintained for the observations that mattered but resisted clinical language, and she watched him until he turned into his room. Then she looked down the corridor toward the nurse's station, where Maya Reyes had returned to her medication chart with the undisturbed focus of a person who had simply done her job. Keisha Truman allowed herself one small, private smile, the kind that costs nothing and means everything. Then she went back to work. In room 14, Ghost sat on the edge of his bed, not lying down, not yet, and looked at the window. The parking lot beyond it was gray in the late afternoon light, unremarkable, exactly the kind of view that offered nothing and asked for nothing in return. He looked at it for a long time with the particular quality of attention that was not looking at it at all, that was looking through it, past it, into the middle distance where the mind goes when it is doing its deepest work. He thought about Harlan County. He thought about the ridgeline outside Kandahar and the shot he never heard and the darkness that followed. He thought about the people who had come to his bedside and spoken to him and found no one home. And he thought about a frequency, transmitted in the dark by a person who had read his file all the way to page 7 of the deployment annex, and understood what 2 words meant to the man who carried them. Ghost Actual, we still need you out here. He had come back for those words. He understood that now with a completeness that the waking mind could hold in a way the recovering mind couldn't. He had come back not because the medicine was sufficient, not because his body was strong enough, not because the will to survive had reasserted itself through some internal mechanism. He had come back because someone had correctly identified which version of him was capable of making the journey, and had spoken to that version directly, with the confidence of a person transmitting to a known operational frequency and expecting a response. Ghost Actual had responded, the only way he knew how. He was still responding. He reached over to the small bedside table and pulled open the single drawer. Inside was a notepad and a pen, standard hospital issue, nothing remarkable. He set the notepad on his knee, held the pen for a moment thinking. Then, in the deliberate block letters he had used for years to log coordinates and mission details, and the operational information that needed to be recorded precisely and permanently, he began to write.